And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting with Carlo Broussard, talking about answering common responses to the Bread of Life discourse. And Carlo, right before the break, you were hitting on probably the most common response of all, that Jesus says that it's the flesh of no avail, that the words he's spoken in spirit and life, which is interpreted as purely symbolic. And so you already gave a couple of really great answers, but I'll let you summarize it and clarify it for us.
Okay, yeah. So before the break, I had pointed out this interpretation of Jesus's words in verse 63 doesn't explain why the disciples still left him after. Given that the disciples leave Jesus after these words, we can conclude that these words are not a clarification of his language to eat his flesh and drink his blood, and thereby an easing of the difficulty. If that were the case, the disciples would have said, no problem, we're still with you, Jesus, and they would not have left. Since they did leave, it follows that this is not a clarification of the difficulty. The word spirit is not synonymous with symbol, which is what the comeback assumes, and we can give evidence for that, as I did before the break. Romans 15:27, John 4:24. Another passage that I didn't include is Hebrews 1:14, where the angels are called ministering spirits, but yet we know, at least as Orthodox Christians here, Orthodox in our theology, angels are not metaphors, okay? But the last point I was beginning to articulate before the break, Gary, was that this comeback fails to consider the idiomatic phrase, the flesh, and what that means. And given the historical backdrop for the Jewish people, and thereby what Jesus would have meant in verse 63. So in the New Testament, the flesh is an expression that often describes human nature apart from God's grace. So that's very evident in Romans 8:1-14. And also, John uses the expression in the sense that it refers to a judgment from an earthly perspective without faith. So in John 8:15, our Lord tells the Pharisees, you judge according to the flesh. So the flesh signifies, it's an idiom, a figure of speech for a judgment that is made apart from God's grace. In other words, apart from faith, from a mere earthly perspective. So if we take that meaning of the idiom, the flesh, with us to John 6:63, and Jesus, after talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, and in response to the disciples having difficulty to assent to it, our Lord talks about the flesh is of no avail. In other words, Gary, as I point out in my book, what our Lord is intending to say here is that judgment from an earthly perspective, judgment without grace, judgment without faith, it ain't going to bring about anything, right? Yeah. It's not going to help you accept and embrace this teaching to eat my flesh and drink my blood, because what is required for assent to this teaching, Gary, is the gift of faith, which only comes by way of the Spirit. Hence the reason why our Lord says, the Spirit gives life, the flesh is of no avail. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. In other words, his words are of a spiritual realm. They're of a spiritual level, a dimension. And so consequently, they require the gift of the Spirit, the gift of faith, in order to assent to it, to embrace it, to understand it, to wrap your mind around it and your heart around it. And for whatever reason in God's divine providence, the disciples did not have that gift of faith for this particular teaching, and consequently, they leave our Lord for it.
Yeah, and that's beautiful, and it fits so well overall with John. You know, in John, Jesus is always speaking on two levels, and it's like his hearers on an earthly level, and he's speaking on a heavenly level, like Nicodemus. You know, what is flesh was, spirit is spirit. When he was talking about the you must be born again. Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
That fits perfectly. Yeah. Great
and
explanation.
I'm glad you brought that up, Gary, because this actually ties in to another comeback that is very common. Well, not as common as the others, but I find very interesting. that I point out in the book. I don't know if you want to go there, if you're ready to
wherever you
move
want
to
to
that
go.
comeback.
Okay. I'm open to anything.
All right, so let's take this as a prompt to move to this comeback. You brought up the born again discourse, where our Lord clearly is distinguishing two levels here, the flesh and the spirit. Our Lord also does that with regard to two levels of meaning. In John chapter 2, verses 15 through 21, where our Lord talks about how, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And notice there, John gives us commentary that our Lord was not speaking of the physical temple, but he was talking about his body. Now, some Protestant apologists will appeal to this very text, Gary, as a comeback to our Catholic argument in John 6. Because in John 6, a common stock line of argumentation is, remember, hey, our Lord does not clarify the literal thoughts of the Jewish people there and his disciples. To which a Protestant apologist will say, well, hey, our Lord leaving people in ignorance, leaving people in their misunderstanding, it's not a big deal. He does it all the time. And here in John 2, 15 through 21 is one example where you have his audience interpreting him to be referring to the physical temple. But yet John tells us he's not referring to the physical temple, he's referring to his body. And guess what, Gary? Jesus does not clarify their literal understanding of the physical temple. He leaves them in their misunderstanding or ignorance. And so the argument goes, if Jesus did that here in John 2, 15 through 21, well, then maybe that's what he's doing in John 6, leaving the Jews in their darkness of misunderstanding. And so that Jesus does not clarify is not evidence for the realistic interpretation of his words in John 6. So that's the common comeback.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard that comeback before. So what's your response to that?
Well, this gets back to the born again discourse, right?
Okay.
So you brought up Nicodemus in the born again discourse. There, notice Jesus does clarify Nicodemus's misunderstanding. Nicodemus is thinking on a physical level, getting back into his mother's womb to be born again. But our Lord clarifies that, reveals to him the spiritual level of what he's talking about, of being born again of water and spirit, which we interpret that to be baptism. So the question becomes, Gary, why would Jesus not clarify the misunderstanding for the Jews there in John 2, but clarify Nicodemus's misunderstanding in John chapter 3? And so what I do in this particular comeback in my book, Gary, is I point out three plausible explanations as to why our Lord did not clarify for the Jews in John 2. Number one, and I think this is quite persuasive, due to the hardness of their hearts. Matthew tells us, according to Matthew's gospel, Jesus had foreknowledge of what these very opponents of his would do at his trial. Matthew tells us in Matthew 26:59 that they bore false testimony, right? Notice how John records Jesus saying, destroy this temple. Yet Matthew reports that his opponents who were charging him at his trial and accusing him, they accused him of saying that he would destroy the temple of God. Check out Matthew 26:61. So notice how the very opponents of our Lord in John 2 at his trial would twist his words due to the hardness of their heart, saying that, hey, this man said he would destroy the physical temple. But according to John's narrative, we know that Jesus said nothing of the sort. Jesus said, destroy this temple. In other words, you destroy this temple, not the physical temple, but his body. So one plausible explanation as to why Jesus doesn't clarify their misunderstanding in John 2 is because of the hardness of their hearts. Our Lord knew the hardness of their hearts and how it would lead them to bear false testimony against him. And for that reason, our Lord leads them in the darkness of their misunderstanding. Whereas when it comes to Nicodemus, who was pure of heart and had faith and wanted to love our Lord and know our Lord clarifies his misunderstanding. Another plausible explanation is that these individuals in John chapter 2 weren't his followers. So it's possible that our Lord leaves the Jews in their misunderstanding in John chapter 2 because they were not his followers. Whereas elsewhere throughout his ministry, he's always clarifying the misunderstanding of his disciples. Now, a Protestant might say, well, this doesn't help you as a Catholic in John 6, because the Jews, the ones who initially had difficulty with his teaching to eat his flesh, they weren't his followers. So maybe our Lord leaves the Jews in the darkness of their misunderstanding because of their hard-heartedness. And that would fit with John's reference to the Jews as those who oppose Jesus. But the problem, Gary, is it's not only the Jews who had difficulty with our Lord's teaching in John 6. His disciples, there in verse 60, had a hard time with his teaching as well. Yeah. And the fact that Jesus did not clarify his disciples' literal thoughts is a strong indication that they were thinking according to in a way that's jibing with what our Lord meant, a realistic interpretation of his words, to eat his flesh and drink his blood. So that's just a summary of how I respond to that particular comeback that appeals to John 2 and saying that, hey, our Lord leaving people in their ignorance is not a big deal.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. No, I've never encountered that objection before. Of course, you also have the problem, too, of the narrative, because if Jesus didn't clarify it and it's a misunderstanding, then the readers of John would be misunderstand the teaching as well. So you would expect the narrator to jump in and clarify, wouldn't you? Otherwise, his own readers wouldn't follow what Jesus is saying.
Yeah, that's a good point, Gary, that I personally have never considered. Like John, that's a good point. Like John jumps in and clarifies what our Lord meant in John 2, given what his audience responded. If his audience took him, if his audience misunderstood him in John 6, the narrator would have clarified it as well there. Good point.
Yeah, awesome. We're chatting with Carlo Broussard about the Bread of Life discourse. More to come right after this.